Hi everyone, this is Neill. I hope you're having a very good term. One of the things that we promised we would do for you is just make some very short little videos which are probably really worth watching after you're several weeks into your teaching, or even as revision if you're further into your teaching. And the first one, which we're calling Teaching Tapas, and the first one is on planning and delivering a really great lesson. Now, you will know, if you came to any of the initial induction sessions, or indeed if you're on the PG Cert, that one of the books that we use in the PG Cert is John Hattie's book, Visible Learning for Teachers. And one of the things he's interested in this book, and in fact in his work in general, is to ask the question, what makes a difference? What are the most important things that make a difference to student performance, how well students do, how much they learn, and how well they achieve? And it turns out that the things that make a difference come in five main areas. The first area, the biggest area, is things to do with the students themselves. Things like how organised they are with their time, how conscientious they are, how many hours practice they put in, whether they spend their practice time doing the right things, all those kinds of things, whether they understand what's expected of them, do they really get what the standards are. All those things make a massive difference to how well students do. That's an area we can influence, and it's a really significant area, but it's not an area ultimately in which we're fully in control. We, however, are interested in the next largest area of things that makes a difference. That's the things that we do as teachers. This is over a third of the factors that make a significant difference to how well students do, and that's the bit that we're interested in, because obviously that's the bit that's in our control. There are also factors that come from the student's home and social background, influences of their peers, and just the way in which the college or university where they're at is organised. Now, John Hattie's looked at a lot of different areas in relationship to things that make a difference to how well students do, and the good news for us is that his findings are very clear, that there are in fact three main things that we need to get right, which are going to help our students learn really well and achieve highly. And also interestingly, if we get all three right together, there's a really strong synergy, and they make each other more powerful than they would be alone. It's really worth, actually, so that you're thinking about this video and engaging with it, pausing just here and thinking, well, okay, from your experience, what do you feel? And there's no like right or wrong answers here, really. From your experience, what do you think are the three most important things that we as teachers need to get right in order to help our students learn well and achieve? Okay, so John's three main findings, in his own words, are the first thing we need to get right is we need to get the right kind of goals. So achievement is enhanced to the degree that students and teachers set and communicate appropriate, specific, and challenging goals. It's a chewy sentence, he's an academic, so he writes in a particular kind of a way, but there's a lot in this sentence. So students do better if they have a goal. That's very clear. It's really important that both students and teachers set and communicate this goal, so there needs to be some dialogue around the goal. It can't just be some bureaucratic thing that gets written up at the beginning of the lesson on the whiteboard and then is ignored. It's got to be genuinely a real part of the lesson. A good goal is the engine that drives the lesson. Ideally, we want to be setting goals, and we want students to be setting their own goals, so that teachers and students are setting these goals and communicating them. We want to make sure that the students have really understood the goal we're setting, and we need to really hear from our students what else it was that they want to achieve, so we can tune into that and help them achieve it. And the goals need to have three characteristics. First of all, they need to be appropriate. They need to be right for the level of the group. Secondly, they need to be specific. We don't want vague goals which no one really understands whether they've achieved or not. They need to be specific and measurable. This is why John calls his book Visible Learning. We literally want to be able to see in the room whether those goals have been achieved or not. And the third thing is we want the goals to be challenging. Not so far ahead of the students that it puts them into a blind panic, but also not so simple that they've achieved it in 10 minutes and then they tune out and they're bored. So they've got to be just ahead of the students in the right sort of way, which again goes back to communication, because we need to be seeing at all points how well our students are doing, so that we really understand where they're at and we can pitch the goals in the right place. The second thing we need is we need feedback. Students need feedback. As I'm working towards a goal, I need feedback that tells me how well I'm doing and what I need to do next. And the third thing that influences how well students do is that they want to not only learn surface information and have deep understanding, but they want to reconceptualize that information. In other words, what they're learning, they need to be able in some meaningful way to make their own. It's no good if they just feel that the information that they're learning or the skill that they're learning is somehow your skill and they're just learning it because you've told them to. It has to meaningfully become their own, and that might mean that they want to do something different or novel or original with it. Now, the good news is there's a very nice way of planning a lesson, which is called constructive curriculum alignment. This comes from the work of John Biggs and Catherine Tang, where by planning in this way, actually, you will include all of those three really good principles from John Hattie's work. So it's a great way of planning lessons, which means that we cover all the things that we need to cover. In future teaching tapas, I'm going to look at some of the elements of this in more detail. So this is just really the overview, and it's called constructive curriculum alignment or constructive alignment. So the first thing we plan when we're deciding on a lesson is we plan what the goals are. What is it that we're trying to achieve together in the room over the 90 minutes or 2 hours, however long the lesson is? What are we trying to achieve together in that room? That's the most important thing, and I need to communicate that to my students. And it's really important that you decide that first before you decide the lesson content. And then you link those up because you think, okay, everything in this model, everything starts from and relates back to the lesson goals. That's why you're going to see double-ended arrows everywhere. Once I've decided the goal, then I think to myself, okay, what's the most important content that students are going to need in order to achieve that goal? What tends to happen often is that people start by thinking about all the content they want to cover, and generally what happens then, what that means is they just put way too much content in, and coverage is the enemy of depth, coverage is the enemy of understanding. We need to pick the right and most appropriate content for the lesson in order to help the student achieve the goals. If there's more content that we want to cover that week than we can fit into the lesson, well, then that goes into homework. That's absolutely fine. The question is, out of everything that you want the student to do that week, what is most important that they should do with you in class? The second thing I then think about is, okay, how are we going to spend our time? So we've decided what the goal is, and we've decided what the most important content is. Sometimes, by the way, it's useful to think about need to know and nice to know for the content. What is the content students absolutely need to know? And then I've got some extra stuff up my sleeve. If we get through that more quickly than I'm expecting, then I've got some extra nice to know I can give them as well. And that's quite a nice way of planning it. So the second thing is, okay, what are we going to do in that time, that 90 minutes together? So we think about choosing the teaching and learning activities for the 90 minutes. And when I'm thinking about that, I think about three things. I think about teacher. What am I going to be doing in those 90 minutes? I think about peers, students working with each other, little groups of students. What are students going to be doing together? And then what are students going to be doing individually? And when you're planning, I think it's really important to have a good mix of all three of those. I think it's also a really good rule of thumb, never spend more than 15 to 20 minutes doing the same thing, because people's attention spans, totally understandably, it's human nature, wander. So you want to kind of switch it up if you can every 15 to 20 minutes. What you certainly don't want is people just listening to you for 90 minutes. That doesn't work at all. The next thing I think about is, well, okay, as we're going through the lesson, I need to know, and more importantly, my students need to know, are they achieving the goals or not? So then we need to think about the assessment methods. By assessment, I don't mean some kind of test, pencil and paper test. It's one thing you might do, but it's unlikely. I mean, how are you going to tell whether those goals are being achieved or not? Very often this will come back to the verb that you've used in the goal. So if you want students to debate something, then you're going to be listening to the debate. If you want them to be able to explain something, then you're going to be listening to their explanations. If you want them to be able to demonstrate something, then you're going to be watching their demonstration. So a good way of knowing whether your goal is a good goal or not is to ask yourself the question, well, how would I know whether this is being achieved or not? And the answer should be very, very clear. If it's not clear, then you need to reword the goal. So we're thinking about the assessment methods. We're thinking about looking to see whether the students are achieving their goals or not. And again, we might have different roles in this. So I think about what's my role as a teacher, but the students might work together in peers and give each other feedback and say, yes, you've achieved that goal, or no, you haven't. And actually, we want to get to the point where students are very good at objectively deciding for themselves whether they've achieved the goal or not. As they're working towards the goal through the lesson, as we said earlier on when we were talking about John Hattie, they need feedback. Feedback has a really significant instructional purpose, a really significant teaching purpose, and it needs to be feedback specifically related to giving students information about how well am I doing towards achieving the goal, what am I not achieving yet, what do I need to do next. So you need to think about when students are going to get the feedback. It's going to be too late if it's just at the end of the lesson. They probably start needing feedback from at least 20 minutes, half an hour in. What are they going to get the feedback on? If you've taught a lesson before, or if you can imagine your way into teaching a lesson, you may very well know, typically, when you're teaching this particular subject, what are the things students struggle with? What do they find difficult? Well, that's probably what they're going to most need feedback on. Who are they going to want the feedback from? Well, again, it can come from you, but it can also come from peers, and they can also do some self-assessment. And how are they going to get it? Is it going to be written down? Is it just going to be verbal? How's it going to be? So those are all the main elements of a lesson that you need to think about as you're planning it. And then I think it's also really useful before you deliver the lesson to think, what am I going to be looking for during the lesson that tells me whether this lesson's working well or not? And maybe have a couple of milestones in mind. Where do you want to be after 30 minutes and where do you want to be after an hour? And make sure that you give yourself some breaks when the students are doing something, maybe 30 minutes in, maybe an hour in, where you can then just slightly stand back from your lesson and think to yourself, is it working as I want it to work? Do I need to course correct? Is there anything I need to change? And then what I do is I loop all the way back to the beginning again, having decided these things, and just make sure that everything is indeed in alignment. All the different elements should be supporting each other, and everything should be really focused on helping your students achieve those learning goals. Now, I know, I'm very well aware that the first time you see this system, it can seem quite complicated and quite cumbersome, and like there's a lot to think about. Actually, if you use this for every single lesson that you teach, I promise you won't go far wrong, because this is what I use myself, and I find it's the most effective system I've ever learnt in my 25 years of teaching for helping me plan a lesson that's going to be effective. And actually it becomes second nature. And it's great because you know that you're not going to forget anything which is an important thing that you need to remember. And when you're used to it, it takes 5-10 minutes, to be honest, to plan a session. Much longer, of course, when you first start using it, but that's just a matter of getting used to it. So those are the different elements that you need to think about when you're going to plan a really effective lesson. And there will be some other teaching tapas you can look at, which are going to dig into each of those elements in a little bit more detail. Enjoy.